Avoidant psychology, why they can't recover after betraying you. The strange thing about betrayal is that people assume the one who caused the damage walks away lighter. They imagine the avoidant leaves untouched, emotionally protected, almost relieved to escape the weight of intimacy they secretly feared from the beginning, but what most people never see is the psychological aftermath that starts long after the relationship ends. Because avoidants don't process pain in real time, they delay it, they bury it beneath distraction, distance, ego, and emotional numbness until months later, sometimes years later, the silence they created starts turning against them, and that's when the betrayal becomes impossible to outrun. Not because you punished them, not because karma arrived dramatically, but because deep down, they know they destroyed the one connection that forced them to feel something real. If this topic hits closer than most people around you understand, subscribe to the channel and stay with this until the end, because the psychology behind this goes far deeper than simple heartbreak. Most avoidants don't recover after betraying someone genuine, not externally but internally. And the reason is darker than people think. The betrayal itself usually begins long before the final moment. Avoidants rarely wake up one day and decide to destroy a relationship. What actually happens is more psychological and far more unconscious. The closer they become to someone emotionally safe, the more trapped they start to feel inside themselves. Intimacy activates everything they spent years avoiding: dependency, vulnerability, accountability, emotional exposure. At first they enjoy the connection because it feels different, calming even, but eventually the emotional closeness becomes overwhelming because it forces them to confront parts of themselves they normally keep hidden beneath control and independence. Instead of communicating this fear, they start disconnecting internally while pretending everything is normal externally. That's why avoidants often betray people in confusing ways. Sometimes through emotional cheating, withdrawal, coldness, dishonesty, disappearing acts, or suddenly treating the person they loved like a burden. The betrayal is not always explosive. Sometimes it's subtle neglect repeated so many times that the relationship slowly bleeds out emotionally. And while the other person is desperately trying to understand what changed, the avoidant is already emotionally escaping before the relationship officially ends. This is why their betrayal feels so devastating. It feels emotionally premeditated, like they abandoned the connection long before they admitted it aloud. But here is what people misunderstand about avoidance. Emotional detachment is not emotional immunity. Just because they look calm during betrayal does not mean they are unaffected by it. In fact, many avoidants emotionally shut down during the process because fully feeling the consequences would overwhelm their nervous system. They disconnect from guilt the same way they disconnect from love, through suppression. This is why they can say cold things during breakups that later haunt them privately. It's why they can appear emotionally distant while secretly experiencing internal chaos they don't know how to regulate. Their mind prioritizes survival over honesty. So instead of admitting, "I'm scared of intimacy," they convince themselves the relationship was suffocating, flawed, or impossible anyway. Rationalization becomes protection. They rewrite the story because accepting responsibility would force them to sit face to face with emotional shame they've spent their entire life avoiding. And the terrifying part is that sometimes they even believe their own justifications temporarily. They convince themselves leaving was freedom, betraying was necessary, distance was power, but emotional suppression has an expiration date. Eventually, reality catches up to the nervous system. Eventually, the silence becomes loud. One of the biggest reasons avoidants struggle to recover after betrayal is because their self-image quietly depends on emotional control. Deep down, many avoidants pride themselves on being unaffected, independent, untouchable. They survive by believing they don't need people the way others do. So when they betray someone who genuinely loved them, especially someone emotionally patient and understanding, they initially protect their ego by acting indifferent. They distract themselves. They move quickly. They pretend nothing meaningful was lost. But over time, something destabilizing begins happening psychologically. The emotional memory of the relationship starts returning in fragments. Not just the good moments, but the safety, the acceptance, the rare feeling of being emotionally seen without needing to perform. And this is where the avoidant's inner conflict becomes brutal, because now they are forced to confront a truth their ego cannot comfortably process. They were loved deeply and they destroyed it anyway. That realization attacks the very identity they built around self-protection. Suddenly, independence no longer feels empowering. It feels isolating. Their emotional numbness no longer feels safe. It feels empty. And because avoidants struggle to process regret directly, they often spiral privately instead of openly admitting the damage they caused. The outside world may still see them functioning normally while internally they are replaying memories they cannot emotionally resolve. What makes this even more painful for them is that losing a genuine connection affects avoidance differently than losing casual relationships. Most surface-level relationships never truly penetrate their defenses. They can leave those situations and move on quickly because emotional vulnerability was never fully activated. But when they betray someone who reached parts of them they normally hide from everyone else, the psychological impact becomes permanent. Not because they suddenly become emotionally expressive overnight, but because their nervous system remembers the emotional safety they lost, and once an avoidant experiences a rare connection that felt emotionally real, every future relationship becomes unconsciously compared to it. This is why many avoidants appear restless after betraying someone meaningful. They keep searching for relief without realizing the problem is internal. New attention cannot erase unresolved guilt. New relationships cannot replicate emotional depth when the avoidant is emotionally unavailable. So they become trapped in a cycle, wanting intimacy, fearing intimacy, sabotaging intimacy, then grieving it in silence after it's gone. And the cruel irony is that the very person they pushed away often becomes the emotional standard their future connections fail to reach. That's why they can't fully recover, because betrayal may protect them temporarily from vulnerability, but eventually it forces them into something even more uncomfortable. Emotional emptiness with no one left to blame for it except themselves. What eventually breaks the avoidant's emotional numbness is not always losing you physically. Sometimes it's watching life continue without them while realizing they can no longer access the version of you that once loved them unconditionally. That is the moment the emotional shutdown begins cracking. At first it happens subtly. A random memory surfaces late at night, a sentence you once said suddenly makes sense months later. A place, a song, a quiet moment triggers emotions they thought they buried successfully. And because avoidants suppress feelings instead of processing them, these emotional fragments return unpredictably and with unusual intensity. What makes this psychologically devastating is that avoidants often do not have the emotional tools to regulate delayed grief. Other people cry, speak, reflect, apologize, seek support. Avoidants isolate. They intellectualize their emotions instead of feeling them directly, so the grief stays trapped internally, recycling itself over and over inside the nervous system. This is why some avoidants become emotionally colder after betraying someone meaningful, not because they stopped caring, but because the emotional consequences became too overwhelming to face consciously. Their detachment hardens as self-defense. Yet underneath that coldness is often a person secretly haunted by the awareness that they destroyed the safest connection they ever had simply because intimacy terrified them more than loneliness did at the time. And the terrifying thing for them is that once emotional suppression weakens, the relationship begins replaying in their mind with painful clarity. Avoidants are known for emotionally minimizing relationships while they are inside them, but after the loss settles in, their brain starts reconstructing memories differently. Suddenly they remember your patience during moments they now recognize as self-sabotage. They remember the reassurance they rejected, the effort they dismissed, the emotional consistency they once viewed as pressure but now understand was genuine love. This replay process becomes psychologically exhausting because the avoidant is no longer distracted by conflict or emotional intensity. They are left alone with reflection, and reflection is dangerous for someone who built their identity around emotional avoidance. Every memory becomes evidence against the story they told themselves during the breakup. They start realizing the relationship may not have been the prison they convinced themselves it was. In many cases, the real prison was their inability to tolerate emotional vulnerability without panicking internally. That realization creates a very specific kind of regret, one rooted not only in loss but in self-betrayal, because deep down they know they were not fighting you, they were fighting the emotional closeness itself. And by the time they finally understand that, the relationship is often too damaged to repair. This is also why avoidants struggle deeply with guilt even if they never express it outwardly. Their guilt is rarely loud or dramatic. It hides beneath silence, distractions, new routines, emotional withdrawal, or relationships that never fully become intimate. Many avoidants would rather carry unresolved guilt for years than openly admit they hurt someone they truly loved, because admitting that pain means acknowledging vulnerability, accountability, and emotional dependence all at once. And for an avoidant, those things can feel psychologically unbearable. So instead, they internalize the guilt quietly. They replay conversations privately. They wonder whether they could have responded differently. They think about reaching out, then stop themselves because shame tells them it's too late, or because pride convinces them vulnerability equals weakness. This creates a painful contradiction inside them. They want emotional relief, but the only path toward relief would require emotional honesty, the very thing they spent their entire life avoiding, so they remain emotionally stuck, neither fully moving on nor fully reconnecting, existing in a strange emotional limbo where the relationship continues living inside them long after the outside world assumes they forgot about it. Over time, your absence becomes psychologically heavier than your presence ever was. That is one of the cruelest ironies of avoidant attachment. While the relationship existed, closeness felt overwhelming because it activated fear. But once the connection disappears completely, the avoidant is forced into a different kind of suffering, emotional deprivation. The nervous system that once panicked over intimacy now starts craving the safety, familiarity, and emotional grounding you provided. Suddenly, the small things matter. The emotional check-ins, the consistency, the feeling of being understood without explanation. Avoidants often underestimate the emotional role someone played in their life until that emotional structure disappears entirely. And when it does, they experience a type of loneliness that feels difficult to explain even to themselves. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of realizing very few people ever reach them emotionally in a real way. That awareness can destabilize them internally because avoidants spend years convincing themselves they do not truly need deep emotional connection. But after betraying someone genuine, the emotional contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Surface-level interactions stop feeling satisfying. Temporary distractions lose their emotional effect faster. Even new relationships may begin feeling strangely hollow because the nervous system remembers what authentic emotional safety felt like before they destroyed it. Yet despite all of this internal regret, many avoidants still never return, and that confuses people more than the betrayal itself. If they feel so much internally, why stay silent? Why disappear? Why let the connection die? The answer lies in the avoidant's deepest fear, rejection after vulnerability. Once they realize the damage they caused, many avoidants become terrified of facing the emotional consequences directly. Reaching out would require accountability. It would require admitting they were wrong. It would require exposing feelings they no longer know how to hide behind distance. And worst of all, it risks hearing that they are no longer wanted. For an avoidant, that possibility can feel emotionally catastrophic because their nervous system is already overwhelmed by shame and regret. So instead of risking rejection, they choose silence, even when silence hurts them too. They convince themselves it's better not to disturb your peace, better not to reopen wounds, better to disappear entirely. But underneath those rationalizations is often fear. Fear that they waited too long. Fear that they destroyed the one relationship that mattered differently. Fear that if they finally become emotionally honest, they will discover they are no longer loved the way they once were. And that fear traps them psychologically between longing and avoidance, creating a wound that never fully closes because they never allow themselves to face it directly. So instead, many avoidants become performers of recovery rather than people who actually heal. They master the appearance of moving on long before they emotionally process what happened. On the surface, they may seem completely unaffected, posting normally, working normally, laughing normally, even entering new relationships surprisingly fast. And this is the part that confuses the person they betrayed the most. It can feel insulting, almost cruel, watching someone who shattered a meaningful connection appear emotionally untouched by it. But avoidants often use motion as emotional anesthesia. Staying busy helps them outrun reflection. New attention helps them temporarily escape guilt. Even new relationships can become psychological distractions from unresolved emotional pain. But the nervous system cannot be manipulated forever. Eventually, the emotional debt returns, usually in silence, usually late at night, usually when life becomes quiet enough that distractions stop working. And that is when the avoidant realizes something deeply uncomfortable. They never truly moved on at all. They only delayed the grief. This delayed emotional collapse can happen months or even years later because avoidants process attachment injuries slowly and indirectly. While other people confront heartbreak immediately, avoidants often feel it after the emotional distance becomes irreversible, and by then the loss feels permanent in a way they were never psychologically prepared for. What makes this even more painful internally is the battle constantly happening between pride and regret. Avoidants often carry enormous emotional pride because independence became their survival identity long before adulthood. Admitting they miss someone deeply can feel humiliating to them, Admitting they sabotaged love can feel even worse, so they become trapped between two powerful emotional forces pulling in opposite directions. One part of them wants to reconnect, apologize, explain everything they couldn't explain before. But another part desperately wants to preserve emotional control. That internal war creates paralysis. They draft messages they never send, they revisit old conversations privately, they imagine reaching out, then convince themselves not to. And every day that passes increases the emotional pressure because silence starts becoming its own form of shame. They know too much time has passed, they know the betrayal caused damage, they know vulnerability is now required to fix what distance destroyed. But avoidants are often psychologically wired to retreat precisely when emotional honesty becomes most necessary. So instead of facing regret directly, they suppress it again, yet suppressed regret does not disappear, it mutates. It becomes emotional heaviness, chronic restlessness, unexplained sadness, emotional numbness, or difficulty attaching securely to future people. This is why many avoidants seem emotionally off after losing someone meaningful. They may function externally, but internally they are carrying unresolved grief their nervous system never learned how to release properly. And the most tragic part is that many avoidants unknowingly sabotage their own healing because healing itself requires the one thing they fear most: emotional exposure. Real healing would mean sitting honestly with the damage they caused instead of escaping into rationalizations. It would mean admitting they hurt someone not because love was absent, but because fear was stronger than emotional courage at the time. It would mean accepting that intimacy was never the enemy, their fear of vulnerability was. But for avoidance, that level of self-awareness can feel psychologically destabilizing because it threatens the emotional defense system they built their entire identity around. So rather than fully confronting the truth, many remain emotionally divided. Part of them longs for deeper connection while another part still resists vulnerability instinctively. This creates a cycle where they continue repeating emotional patterns even while secretly grieving the consequences of those patterns. And the terrifying thing is that avoidants are often highly aware of this contradiction internally. They know they push away what they want most. They know they create emotional distance and then suffer because of it afterward. But awareness alone does not immediately create change, especially when avoidance has been their primary survival mechanism for most of their life. So they remain caught between emotional longing and emotional fear, unable to fully return to who they were before the betrayal, but also unable to fully evolve beyond it. This becomes especially visible in future relationships, because once an avoidant loses someone who genuinely reached them emotionally, every new connection starts carrying invisible comparisons. Not necessarily comparisons of personality or attraction, but comparisons of emotional depth. The avoidant begins noticing how rare it actually was to feel emotionally understood without needing to perform independence constantly. They start recognizing how difficult it is to recreate authentic emotional safety once trust has been broken internally. And this realization follows them quietly into future dynamics. They may date people who feel easier because the emotional stakes remain shallow. They may choose emotionally unavailable partners because those dynamics feel psychologically safer. But deep down, the nervous system remembers the difference between temporary comfort and genuine emotional connection. That memory becomes impossible to erase. This is why avoidants often revisit old relationships mentally long after they ended. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because the emotional imprint remained unresolved.